It's going to be a workshop on hooks, redux, and bundling. The top 3 questions that I get a lot with developers asking about how to do specific programming. Most importantly, what is state management with Redux? How to set that up, and also web bundling with Webpack. I'm not going to post this on the Meetup. I'm going to keep it small. This is going to be our first time around. It's going to be 2 days. If you're interested, hit me up after the talk. Give me your email, and then we'll keep you updated like that. It's going to be small. We're thinking about maybe 40 people total for 2 days. Very small workshop, very in-depth. If you're interested, come hit me up after the talk. Give me your email address, and I'll keep you posted as things roll out. Hopefully in the next 2 months, we'll have a definitive place, schedule, and a kind of like a timeline for that. So what I want to present today is this application that I wrote for this talk. You can go right now. It's the bookpundit.app. It's live. You can play with it right now. We can. It's a mobile app. There's my GitHub repo. It's exactly what I'm going to talk about. All the code is already hosted there. If you do have a browser or web page, you can definitely check it out. Can't show it here. Can we get on the screen? Is it? Yeah, so it's a Book Pundit. It's a simple app. It's very, very few components involved, but you can play with it right now. Look for a title of a book. So we got a little React suspense there, a little lazy loading. Basically, it gives you a list of these books, right? Nothing special with the ratings on it, and then you click into it, it gives you the reviews of that particular book. Right, and you just read about it. Some critics or pundits, they really get into reviewing these books. It's really interesting if you read through them, some of them. So yeah, that's basically it. Again, you have a React suspense going on in the background, right? Fetching it, pulling the data in. So that's basically the app that I wanted to that I built for this presentation. And so what I'm going to cover for this presentation is just like the application architecture, how to think about it. What is application architecture? Briefly talk about the Webpack, what you need to set up. I recently got into DevOps. And so a lot of the DevOps mentality, the concepts, kind of, it's a Webpack, right? We're building our asset pipelines and so on and so forth. And so it's once you build it out, it's just cookie cut, copy paste. You can use it over and over and over again in all your applications. And then I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about React and Friends. We got some hooks, we got some Redux, we got some sagas, and I'll go talk about what they are. But starting off, I'll be talking about the backend and then moving to the front. So this is like the 10,000-foot view of this application. It's hosted, the front end app is hosted on Netlify. Super simple, really recommend them. You push to your Git branch master, and it, kind of like a continuous integration or a continuous deployment. In the back end, I got 2 clusters. I'm using Docker Swarm in the back. I got a node balancer, a load balancer with Nginx, and everything else is basically Node.js. This Node 1 service, all it does is a router. It's a very simple router, bare bones. All it does is routing to the other clusters the APIs. And then, of course, you have your canonical database. I'm using Postgres for this, also in a container. The APIs is where I'm getting the data. So I'm integrating with Goodreads. I'm integrating with AWS, integrating with Open Library, right? Pulling out those books, pulling out the reviews, and so on and so forth. And so I set and these APIs I set them up like functions as a service. They have one function. All they do is pull the data, they transform it, and they spit it out. That's all they do. There's nothing hardcore about them. It's literally maybe 2 or 3 libraries in there, and that's it. And I put them in containers so they spin them up, spin them down, wipe them out, update them. If I continue with this project, I can easily add up another node server in the backend, another API, maybe, I don't know, GoReads, right? GoReads is another book e-commerce. So this is kind of the idea, right? This is like the application overall architecture. And what I will talk about today is the Netlify aspect of this. So talking about, setting up your Webpack, it's very important to, once you have your asset pipeline set up, like I was mentioning before, it's very easy to reuse it. So if you take the time to learn the Webpack, the upside is, you never really have to reconfigure it, right? You're always going to be parsing JavaScript. You're always going to be parsing CSS. You got your files, images, fonts. Once your pipeline is set up, you copy and paste it to all the other projects, and you can scale it out that way. You don't have to reinvent the wheel every single time. Or maybe, you have to update Webpack to get the optimizations, but I mean, whatever, right? Once you understand the pipeline, the DevOps associated with it, you can start reusing them. And so Webpack is very powerful. There's only 4 major concepts you have to understand with Webpack. That's the entry, right? What file to start with. The output, how do you want your files to be outputted? Plugins and loaders, and I'll talk about them in a bit. So with it makes no sense if I can't show you. The code. Is that good? Is that pretty big? Everyone can read that? Yep. So with Webpack, once you have your pipeline set up, right, once you have these concepts down, your entry, your output, your plugins, and your loaders, those 4 concepts, you can do whatever you want to do with it. However you want to configure your applications. It's really powerful. Think about DevOps. It's very, very similar to DevOps. This is Webpack for your front end, essentially. And so what we start off with, the way this application is set up is there's a base configuration, there's a development configuration, and there's a production configuration. So the development configuration is obviously to use hot reloading and so on and so forth, right, to maximize the efficiency while you build the app. Production is where you minify all you bundle it, you minify, you apply all these transformations on your code so that it's optimized for the static CDN that you use. You don't care about that while you're building it, right? You leave that to the production. So that's why I create 3 different configurations, and using these 4 concepts associated with them. And so with the Webpack, your entry is your starting point. What file is the HTML, right? This is your index HTML file. Your output, how you want your files to be set up or chunked. Your modules contain loaders. And what your loaders do is they take your files and they transform them. Webpack is JavaScript, right? If you have CSS, you have to tell JavaScript how to do it, how to transform your CSS. If you have images, if you have other files, you have to tell Webpack how to transform them. And that's what loaders do. And these are these rules associated with that. Here I'm transforming my fonts, images, right? So those are the loaders concept. And the plugins are kind of like, they're kind of like not transformations, but they kind of enhance, or like they provide injections into your build pipeline. And so in our case, for this application, our entry point is index.html. Very simple. This is our entry point template, and this is the ID that once the page loads, once the JavaScript loads, it's going to inject everything inside this div, right? So Webpack does this for you. You don't have to worry about this. You don't have to do any document.get element ID. You don't have to do any of that stuff. Webpack will take care of all that stuff for you. There's also, for the CSS, it's very important for the CSS that everyone's very opinionated about CSS. There's CSS in JavaScript. There's CSS modules, right? Inline styles. Everyone has their own flavor associated with it. Webpack, you can configure it however you want it to do. I have this configured as, another thing too I should mention, you configure it twice, one for development and one for production. For development, you don't really care about minifying your CSS. You don't really care about shrinking your class names to, like hexadecimals or whatever, or hashes. You don't really care about that stuff. So when Webpack loads, I want Webpack to load my CSS very differently than if I load it in production. And so for my CSS, the loaders have to be, .css. You specify how you want your CSS to be processed. One thing, too, that's very confusing about Webpack is that it processes your application files bottom up. So in this rule set, it's an array. This array has, multiple objects inside of it. But Webpack is going to take the very last one and use it first to transform your CSS, right? So it's going to go from the bottom to the up. So another thing that's very opinionated about CSS is should I use SaaS? Should I use less? Maybe post CSS. What's the other new stages coming out for CSS, right? I want to use the new features for CSS. So depending on what kind of loader you want to use and what kind of options you want to have with your application, you specify the loader. Here, I'm using post CSS. Post CSS has all the features that less and SaaS has. I'm also using this loader here called pre-CSS. Sometimes I feel like writing markup in SaaS, right? That's what I started off 4 years ago. It's a bad habit to get rid of, but whatever. If I feel like writing SaaS, I go ahead and write it. I don't have to worry about it, right? The Webpack will take care of it for me. If I don't write it, it's all right. It's just going to skip this step. Webpack is smart enough to know when to transform and when not to transform. So after my CSS load or post CSS loader, it goes into the actual Webpack loader, CSS loader. And then here at the very end, you're telling Webpack how to inject the style sheet into your code. Right? Do you inject it in the header? Do you inject it in line? Do you separate it on a separate file? Right? So you get to pick how you want that to be done. And here, because I'm using CSS modules, I tell Webpack, hey, for every CSS file that you come across with, make its own module, right? I don't want to load all my CSS at one time when the application loads. I just want it to load on demand as needed. There's external libraries. I know there's CSS and JavaScript is very, very talked about. You can easily plug in styled components. You can also plug in down here. You have to just find the loader for it. Glamorous, Radium, right? You have to import a library that will take your CSS in the JavaScript, right, and transform it so that it's injected at the top of the page once the JavaScript runs. So there's a lot of flexibility. You just have to figure out what you want to do and how you want to do it. Once you do it, you set it up once, fire and forget kind of thing. And then finally, of course, JavaScript. So for development and for production, very different uses. You're going to use JavaScript very differently. If you're using the latest, or if you want to use the latest JavaScript, ES6, ES7, 8, 9, whatever's out there, whatever stages, maybe you want to use the pipe operator, right? You come here. This is where you will put the loader in that will transpile your JavaScript into something that's compatible in the browser. You tell Webpack how to do it, and once it's set, it's done. You don't have to worry about it. Another thing, too, is for all your vendor files, right, React, Redux, Redux sagas, if you're using styled components, right, they're all vendors. They're all external libraries. You tell Webpack what to do with them once, as it's transforming them. And we'll go through it of how you set it up so that all the vendor JavaScript is its own file, right? Once it gets to the browser, it gets cached in the browser, and so you don't have to keep reloading it over and over again. And so we'll get to that, which is pretty amazing what Webpack can do. This also takes your components and splits them up, right? You can do lazy loading, code splitting. And then last but not least, I really want to talk about how optimizations. I really leave all optimizations for production. I don't really mess around with them during development. You don't really care about it in development. You just want your application to load as fast as possible once you start doing changes. But for production, you got to take a step back and think about what exactly you want to minify, because you can get very, very detailed, which is awesome. Here, when I wrote this app, I forgot to minify the code. And I was downloading, if you hit the app, it was close to like a megabyte. I came here and you see this, I just copy and paste it from a previous project. And if you look in the browsers now, it's at maybe 400 megabytes. Still pretty large. I'm not really happy with it, but you can see the difference between not minimizing and minimizing. So it's always good to, whatever project you're working on, to minimize, right? And then we also do split chunks. Here's where you take your code and you chunk it, right? You split it out. If you're using, if your servers have HTTP protocol 2 enabled, right? They load on demand. So you can open one connection and suck in all the files as if it's one connection and take advantage of that protocol, right? So you can have dozens of split files downloaded to the app at really at the cost of one connection. So it's really good to take advantage of the technology that's coming out and how Webpack really helps you take advantage of those things. So what I want to talk about next is app architecture. I know we struggle a lot with this. Conversations always go to like, what exactly do you mean by architecture? Does it mean like Angular? Does it mean whatever the docs say on the .NET ASPX? It's kind of confusing, especially when you're talking to computer science individuals and individuals that change jobs and are engaged in this conversation, and the way they taught themselves is through blog posts like myself. It's kind of hard to figure out what this is, but it really comes down to the business logic. When you're building a front end, it's very important to understand, to ask this question: what is the business logic? If you can't answer this question, if you can't sit down and write a list of rules of what is business logic, you can't do the next step, which is you can't map the logic to the technology that you're using. I guess you can, but it's going to be like this big old blob instead of like which leads to my third point is that you want to organize it so that your application scales, that it evolves with it. If you have experience working with teams where it's very difficult to just get a feature out there, either because their pipeline is horrendous, or because the file structure of their application is 20 files deep with over 1,000 lines of code, right? It's not very thought out. The logic is spread out everywhere. It's like spaghetti, right? So it's very important to think about application architecture. And for this app, it was very simple. I need book data. I need book reviews. I need to sign up for Amazon. I need to get API keys, right? You make a list of these things, and then once the designs are done, you start asking yourself questions like, okay, so how can I map this component to this? How can I store this component to that? And we'll get into those details in a bit. At the end of the day, though, you want to ask yourself, how can this evolve? And so your architecture really is a telltale sign of red flags. Is it going to evolve? If your developers are having a hard time, it's pretty much your architecture it probably needs some improvement. So what is exactly business logic? So there's three main components to business logic: data manipulation, conditionals, and asynchronous flow, right? You live in the browser. Do you want the browser to do all the manipulation? Well, it has to do some, right? User input for sure. Do you have a table? Are you showing like spreadsheets? You're going to probably do some computations with those spreadsheets. Merging response data. I'm getting JSON calls from the backend. I got to take that JSON calls and split it up, merge it together, right? So it's doing some computation. So as the browser is loading, JavaScript in the background is doing data manipulation. That was decided based on what I thought would be the business logic. I didn't just randomly do it. It was just like sit down with a pen and paper, draw them pictures. Like, okay, this is going to work out. This is not going to work out. This is data manipulation. I want the data manipulation in the back end. I don't want it in the front end, right? So the more specific, the more knowledge you have the business logic, your business logic in the front end can either make it easy or uneventful for you. Conditionals, right? If you're online, offline, business. Does the business care that it's online or not? Maybe, I don't know. Is it caching or not cache? Do you want to keep hitting the server over and over again? For this application, I'm caching on the browser the books that you search, the book lists, and all the book reviews. So for some reason, if you want to go back to it, it's just there, right? You don't have to hit back the server. And then sometimes I put here, if wrong, wrong, then right, because business logic is one of those human things where you have the project manager come in, say some stuff, makes completely no sense, but you have to do it. It's just one of those, you can't really get rid of unnecessary code. It's kind of like you have to minimize it, right? It's one of those things. And asynchronous flows, obviously, anything that touches async on the front end, local storage, if you're using workers, service workers, if you're doing API calls, other asynchronous APIs that the browser exposes, that's business logic. Why are you going to waste time using local storage when the business doesn't care? Or workers, if you're not doing anything computational intensive. Or rather API calls, if it's just a web page. So from the business logic, once we understand the business logic, we can map out to the technology. And so in the front end, and specifically with React, what we're doing and what we talk about is essentially components. That's it. this is like the fundamental level of front-end development today. It's just components. Everything is a component. And these components, you know, display HTML. They deal with user input. They talk to other components. They talk to the outside world. Your components have to deal with updates, so on and so forth, right? So it gives us the concept of, okay, so now I have these building blocks. Okay, how much logic, how much code should these building blocks contain within them, right? If you have jQuery or some other, maybe even WordPress's pages, you know, these components, they didn't even have this concept of components. They just had, you know, these templates, and these templates were huge. And it's really hard to logically walk through them. It's really logically hard to share them with other people, talk about them, to educate them, to bring them up to speed. Apologies. And so React, Webpack, this whole front-end ecosystem, what it has done is, you know, something that Unix philosophy has always been chatting about, you know, single responsibility functions, single responsibility components. And so once we understand the logic, how can we map that logic into the components? Right? You don't want a big old blob. You just want one big blob taking care of everything. You want it to separate it into like separation of concerns, for example. And so this, continuing this mapping to technology, right? So in React, we have the presentation layer. That logic translates into the presentation layer. We use React for that. That's the technology that we use. The front end triggers actions, or the user does actions on the front end that trigger events, right? Okay, we got that down. Data, Redux. Redux will take care of the data layers for us. State management, it's kind of treated like a mini database. Very similar concepts to the backend. Front-end development is not that different from back-end development. The concepts are very, very unified in this regard. Asynchronous, right? We're going to use sagas. It's very important to lay out your pipeline, your workflow. Sagas is a tool that makes it, you know, really, I was going to say fun, but it makes it really composable so that your business logic doesn't just map to one component doing all these things. Your business logic maps to multiple pieces. And so once you have that down, you sit back and you ask, okay, what do I know? And you draw out boxes. You draw out an architecture pattern of what you, of your application. There's no business logic associated with it per se, but this is a technology that you'll be using. You know what these parts are doing. All these parts have code. All these parts belong to a folder, a file, right? There's a hierarchy here. And when the designer or the project manager comes in and asks, hey, we have to put this new feature in, you can point to your architecture and be like, it's going to go here, and this is going to go here, right? And so what is our mental model? From this architecture, you know, we want to create a component model. We have multiple components. How do we write those components down? And how does that translate, most importantly, to the folder layout? Because this is where the tire meets the road, right? So this is what I'm going to be sharing with the team. This is what the team will be contributing to, is writing code in a folder layout that you didn't write, that you didn't create. It was given to you. The business was there. You got hired. And that junior developer or the other senior developer comes in, downloads the repo on GitHub. The first thing is going to interact with the application is the folder. And you go into the folder layout, and you do one of these, I guess, characteristics of these layouts. You might open a folder with 100 files inside of them. And then when you want to change something, you got to go through 50 files to change them. It's a nightmare. Been there, done that. Think about it, right? Does it scale? Does it evolve? So I wanted to go back to the app because I want to show components. So here we have, you can't really tell. Well, maybe I can show here. No, okay. So we have a search component, search bar component, and it's pretty, I've done search bars 5 or 6 times. They're never easy. It's very difficult. I have troubles with them. So I did the next best thing. I just went to Google and I just copied what they're doing, essentially. But the functionality, right? You type in a book. So there's 2 ways to launch the search. One is pressing the enter key. One is pressing the search key, right? If you click the X, this search bar has to be like, hey, you click the X, here's the panel. It maintains history of the last 5 search results that you do. Very similar to what Google search does. And you get the option to, you know, I don't want this in my search anymore. You click it out. So that search bar is maintaining state. The search bar is doing a call to the backend. That search bar is maintaining state of your history of your searches, so on and so forth. So it's very component heavy, and I'll talk about how I split that up. So another component here is obviously the book card. Right? There's a nice little card that handles a click. It does a React suspense, right? It shows a spinner. And then it, once the JSON payload comes in, it displays reviews, right? So this component is pretty heavy as well. Oops. So before I get into the components, one thing that is very complicated or very challenging to beginners is just state management. What is state management? Why do you need state management? And how many types of state management are there? There's, I know 4, maybe there's more. I don't know. React is evolving constantly every single few months. So I'm just going to go very briefly through the 4 states that you can do with your React application right now. And we're all acquainted with prop drilling. You have data. It goes to the parent component. But your child component needs the data. So your parent has to pass this data to the child component before it reaches the child component, right? They call it prop drilling, top bottom. You use it sometimes, you use it I don't know, all the time, I don't know, depending on what you're trying to do, I suppose. But it's just a method that you can use that you can exploit and while you're managing your state. Another one is context, right? You have your provider accepts the data, you register your child component as a consumer, the data skips everything in between and just goes directly to that child component. The next one is Redux, right? Redux is one store, one data center, and any component has access to it, right? And then the last one is you give every component its own little world. So you can imagine the nightmare it is to, when they start talking to each other, the duplication of data of the interaction. And so the approach is, the question is, which one do you use? And the answer is you have to use whatever the problem calls for, right? You don't go into this situation thinking I'm only going to use Redux. Like, I mean, you can. I wouldn't recommend it doing it, right? So you look at the problem, you think about it, and I'll show in the code base that I use all 4 steps on how to maintain state. So now that we have this, I guess, augment to our component model, right? Let's do the mapping. Designer gives us a mock-up or SketchUp, whatever. we sit there with a marker and we check out like, all right, this is going to be our components. We go there and we check them out, right? Before I wrote any code, this is what I did. And this is what I've done in previous projects. I want to make sure that I understand the problem, I understand the logic, I understand where the data is going to be passing by. And most importantly, I want to make sure that when I talk to somebody about this project, I can show them this and walk them through the steps associated with it, right? You want to make them guess less and come on the team and start cranking out code, right? So that's kind of like our mental model that we got here. And there's no one right way of doing this. There's multiple ways of doing this. This is just something I did on the fly, right? And to be honest, there's a lot of improvements here, but so another part of the component model is what components are going to do the data fetching. You don't want all of them to do the data fetching. So I said, all right, you know what? At the very top level, my app component, the very top parent level, is going to do one call to the external world, and that's the fetch books. That is the call that gets all your data for your book list. And then another component is going to be wired up to make the call to get the reviews associated with that book. And that's my book card component, right? So according to the business logic that was defined, I chose these two components to take care of the handling of the external API calls. And think about these lines here. I didn't really point them out, but think of these lines from left to right and from right to left as a saga. There's certain processes there. There's code in there, this pipeline, that's taking that request and transforming it and doing things with it before it calls out and when the call responds back, right? So I know they're lines, and I should have done a better job of it, but just think about these lines are the sagas, right? These are the pipelines. These are the components. So components are not just circles. Components are also arrows. And of course, you have redux, right? Redux, if a book that you have searched already is cached, Redux is just going to serve it to you. There's no reason to call out to the external world. It's right there in the Redux state. It's inside your database. So really quickly about React hooks. So this is not a comparison between classes and functions. The next meetup will be. The next meetup will be a very immersive React hooks meetup where we'll go in there and make comparisons between classes and functions, and why I guess hooks are awesome. Who's here is playing with hooks right now? They're pretty fun, right? They're pretty fucking awesome. I mean, I enjoy them a lot. When I started learning this, I was like mind blown. Why? Because I wrote this whole application without using a single class. They're all functions. There's no class at all. If you're a beginner, you don't need to know classes. You don't need to worry about what is this, right? It's a lot of confusion. This completely eliminates that. Hooks completely eliminates that. It goes back to the basics of what JavaScript is just functions. Function first language. So of course, React Hooks is a library. It has an API that hooks into the render cycle and life cycle. So with that in mind, once you start learning React Hook, there is an upside. There is a uphill to learning these, and these are the APIs. These are 5 APIs that I use within the application. I'll talk about them briefly, but I don't want to go too deeply into how the differences between them and like classes are. But it's pretty amazing that you do not need to know this or classes at all as a newbie. You can just come in there and start cranking out code. So UseState. UseState is very similar to this .state, right? It's a state of the component. It follows this model where every component has its own little world. But the thing is, you guys take a step back and think about what data do I really want in my components? Do I want all the reviews inside a component, or should I put all my reviews inside a Redux state, right? Do I want my styling inside my Redux, or do I want my styling within the component that's going to be using that styling, right? So there's trade-offs. You got to think about these things. And UseState provides that hook that says, I'm going to store it inside the component, right? Conceptually, it follows this model. It's inside the component. UseEffect. UseEffect is the lifecycle hooks of that we all are all familiar with. Component did mount, component will update, component will receive, blah, 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 right? UseEffect takes all those lifecycle hooks and makes it as a function. It takes a function, that function, when your component first renders, right? The next thing that the component does is run this function, UseEffect, which hooks up all your event listeners into it, right? And then on top of that, whatever you return back, you can, remove that. So it's a function that sets up your event listeners and returns. Once the component is no longer on the DOM, it removes that event listener. And how does this thing keep update to state? And so the second parameter that UseEffect provides, here it's called increment counter, but if you have a state variable called increment counter, UseEffect will only reload or re-render only when that parameter changes, right? No matter what other things are happening in the world around this component, if the only thing that changes is increment counter, then it will render. So it's very specific. You have very fine control over it. Again, it's nothing new. You could have done this with classes as well. But again, it's all functions. UseContext, another state model. It's not very different from what it is today. The only difference is that your consumer uses the function UseContext. Your parent still has to create the context, provide a wrapper, the provider. Your children inherit that provider, and then you pick out the consumer, and that consumer uses the context. And then you have the use reducer. This is one of my favorite things about it. It's very similar to Redux. Who's here is using Redux right now? Yes. Your components have reducers now, which is pretty amazing. It's just it's an enhancement to UseState. So if your component has maybe 5 or 6 parameters, I'll show one of my components does. Instead of calling UseState, 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 you just spin up a use reducer, and you use it just like if it's a Redux reducer. You have your state and you have a dispatch. And then with that dispatch, you can pass it down into your components. And so your components, now, they can dispatch up to your reducer, right? So you get a very good functionality out of Redux into the components, which is really awesome. UseRef, if you want to do two-way data binding, UseRef, right? You hook into some element or component, and you want to pass, I call it here component passing mutable values, because when you use this function, UseRef, that ref container, you can treat it as a bucket. You can pass anything you want inside of it and give this value, this ref container, to any component to push back into the value in a mutable state. So for example, you want to do like an input, and you want to do autocorrect, right? You hook into the input value. I put some letter or some word, I misspell it, but you want to autocorrect it. You hook back into it. It changes the value inside the input, right? This is something that you'll use for that, for behavior and for mutable values. So really quickly, in the search component, right, very top level, this is where I use the reducer. This component is responsible for handling the communication between the search bar and the search panel, right? So this part right here, that panel right there, it's a different component. And so that component has to pass data to the search bar. So if I select HTML, it's passing that value up to the search bar, and it's performing a search. So that search component is brokering the messaging between these two components. And both components are using UseState, UseReducer, and UseRef. For the search bar, right, there's a lot of, like I said, search bar has been a challenge for me. There's just a lot of behavior associated with the search bar: change, click, focus, key press, search term. I tried to mimic the behavior of the Google search, but the search bar only uses UseState and UseContext. That's it. And the UseContext here is, it's better to show you the code. So you got my components here, search component. So here's my search component. Right, that picture of the search, this is it. This is my representation of that idea. It has a reducer here. The very first thing is I'm going to set this up. Reducer is just like your redux reducer. You pass it to state, you have an action. The states here are also defined by your initial state, right? It's very redux. So this component is responsible for these four values: search term, search history, has search history, and this panel open. And so when the component, in this case, when the search panel calls these or dispatches these actions, it updates the state here in this component. So this is my reducer. This returns to you that state, right, and your dispatch. With this dispatch, I'm passing that opportunity or that functionality to both of my components, the search bar and my search panel. So now those two components can communicate up to the parent by using just the actions. So UseState takes in the initial value that you want to use. It outputs an array with two elements. Styles is the variable, and a set, right? A getter and a setter. When this component loads, this function runs. This is where all my lifecycle hooks get loaded. Right, and when you think about it, should this business logic live elsewhere, or should this component be responsible for it? I made the decision that, you know what, this is very similar. This is a property of the component, right? I'm just setting styles here. So I want to keep this state inside this component. So set styles is that state inside the component. Search panel. So the search bar, you set it up just like your pure component or just your presentation component, right? Before, we always talked about containers, logical containers, and then your presentational containers, your dumb containers. So everything's a function. There's no more classes. So you spin up a function, you call it search bar, you write the you return the JSX, right, and you export it. It's very similar to the classes, but again, it's just functions. The search bar is a little, behavior driven, a lot of logic inside of it, but it belongs in the search bar. It doesn't belong in Redux. It doesn't belong in sagas, and that's a decision that I made. You can come up with something else. It's fine. right? And so so when you click on that fetch book, I'm dispatching to the parent. And dispatch is coming from the use reducer. It takes in your attributes, style components, it's using context. Context, again, is coming from the parent. And just to show you how I set up the context. So basically, I have a folder called context. Inside the context, I was playing around with some stuff, but inside the context here, you just call this. You call the function. If you're already using React context, it's no different. You import it into the component that will be using the context or setting up the context. In this case, it's my app, right? The very top parent, and I have my provider. And in here, I have all the children associated with that. And so any one of these components, any one of these children can just call UseContext and pull that data from it. So what data is the context providing? Well, it's providing the values that is returned from the book list. That initial payload is going to pass to the very top parent, and then it's going to get passed down to the search bar. And so, and here I use it. So another thing too with the context, here I'm using the context not as a storage of values, but as a callback. So here's my app context. I'm giving it a value of this function called fetch book list. And here's that logic associated with that. So you can use the app context not just to pass, state values, whatnot. You can actually pass in callbacks. And this way, when you hit that space bar, or when you hit the enter key, or when you hit that button, it's calling this function that belongs into the parent component. And the parent component is responsible for fetching the books, right? So if you look at the model, I'm just setting this up, right? Using all that logic associated with that for this one component and figuring out how they're all going to communicate with each other. And so the search panel has a child component called search item. So every single bar of those is search, which also, if you look at the app, it does perform functionalities. So if you click on this button, right, it's going to call the parent. It's going to say, hey, fetch the book, fetch the CSS. In this case, the CSS book list was cached, so Redux just returns back to you the cached version of it. So a lot of logic, a lot of communication between components. The book list. The book list is just straight inheritance, right? This is one of those prop drilling examples where if you don't really take a step back and think about how you're going to pass the state between your components, the easiest way to kill yourself is to start passing props at the very top. And then every component just hands off the state to the other component, right? So if you take a step back and think about, okay, so how I'm going to take care of this, right? So I'm going to say my book card is the only one responsible for reaching out to the external world or talking to Redux. It's going to use the fetch book reviews, it's going to use UseStay, and it's going to use UseEffect. Book card and reviews. So book reviews live inside the book card component, So all the data that coming into the book card has to come out to the book reviews. And so book card reaches into Redux or to the sagas, and it calls that data into book card is listening to updates and passes on to the book reviews, if there are book reviews. And so that looks like, it's not that different from the other components. And once you start seeing the pattern over and over again, because I mean, it's all functions, it's all JavaScript, the book card, it's pretty fat. It has a lot of the properties of what you see. I have a spinner, right? The suspense, lazy loading, and then if there's no book reviews, there's no book reviews. But because I'm doing a lot of work here in this component, maybe I can refactor it so that it won't be so fat. It is reaching out to Redux. It is being, it is calling for a fetch, right? Some business logic. But the thing is, this does not live inside the component. The component just creates the event. The event is then captured in my sagas. My sagas are the things that respond to the actions. And so we're familiar with action creators. I define my sagas per channels. So all the logic for fetching reviews belong in one channel. And only for book reviews. All my logic for searching belong in another channel. I call it search channel, right? It's really awesome names. It's simple to remember. But most importantly, it's very easy to communicate and share with other people. Search channel. And this channel listens to actions, the set book and the set current search, right? And then the reviews also listens to one action from the reader. And that's when you click on the card, launches that action goes into my sagas. And this is a setup, kind of like my pipeline. So this saga consists of 3 functions: fetch the books, process the results, and then store the results. And that's it. It's very easy to communicate, easy to share, very easy to understand. This component, saga component, is only responsible anything related to book reviews, right? There's no bleeding, there's no mixing search or anything like that, right? I like to keep things very, very separate and very clean. And so here's where the magic happens. In this function file, very simple function, it takes that action that my saga received, fetch the books. Anyone using Redux sagas? 1, 2. What are people using? Like, they're using observables or thunks? So sagas is a little bit more involved. I like them a lot. They're based off generators. If you're not familiar with generators, you might have a learning curve there, but it's definitely a way to level up when you're in JavaScript. Once you learn generators, it's really amazing what you can do with them, and this library is built with generators. With that in mind, this library exposes certain APIs that takes advantage of those goodies, and just like if you want to learn hooks, you have to learn their APIs, UseEffect, use callbacks, use reducers. With sagas, you have to learn their APIs too. They're not difficult. Put, select, take, call. They all mean something very specific. You take an action. If a component is calling, you take it. Select, reach into Redux. Select the state inside Redux. In this case, review results. If the results, if this book has already been previewed in the past, it's cached. Pull it, or you know what? Call this action, store results to retrieve it. If it's not, then this is where you do your outside call to the world. Right? This is your browser calling to the node service. And I'm not using Axios. I'm just using their basic browser API here called Fetch. It does these great things. This is resolved by these variables. Environment variables is resolved by Webpack. So you don't have to worry about that. You can treat it exactly like if you're doing backend development. And you wrap it in a promise, and you resolve it, and you reject it if there's errors, right? And that's it. Once that's done, once a call comes back, you're gonna, in your Saga component, you're gonna call another action. You're gonna process that. Because this component here, this function does one thing only, just get the data. That's it. I don't want you to do anything else, just get the data. You're gonna write another file called process results that will process the results. You want to do data manipulation. If there's certain conditionals about caching it into local storage or what have you, or if there's other data-intensive computations, maybe you have to spin up a worker, right? This is where you do it. You spin up a new file, a new function, give it a name, make it very specific to one thing only. In this case, I'm not doing anything with it. I'm just grabbing it and storing it. And so in my store, again, all I'm doing here is calling the reducer. So the reducer is listening to these actions, and it's going to store the data. Now, you can copy and paste these actions and put them here. But then you're defeating the purpose of single responsibility, right? This process search results is just processing the result. It's not doing anything else. Don't make it do anything else. Keep it simple. Write another single function, 46 lines or less, 16 lines of code that just handles the storing the results, right? Separation concerns. Have this component only fixated on one thing only. And so when that saga is done, it calls the reducers, in this case, review. If you've been using Redux, very similar, nothing new here, right? Set reviews, you set the reviews, and you're done. You set the current review, and you're done, right? The reducer is very, very lean. All it does is take the data and save it, and that's it. It doesn't do any data processing. You leave that to the sagas. It doesn't do any data manipulation. Again, you do it, leave that into the sagas. Very clean, very single function. And last, book review. That is the, right? This is, I guess, if you want to think about it, the business value. This is why people want to use this app, people want to buy this app, whatever, right? Because of reviews. And so this component, the single responsibility of this component is it doesn't store anything. All it does is just render it. It's your done component, your component. We all know done components. All it does is HTML and CSS, and that's it. There's no behavior associated with it. It takes the HTML coming from the parent component and just renders it. And that's it. There's no logic associated with it. It's just a very dumb component. You could easily copy and paste this into your book card and be done with it. Why separate it out to a different component? It's just the logic, the business logic just says reviews are very different from cards, right? Again, understanding the business logic can really, really help you out on mapping to the technology, to the component model that you will be using. And so, because it lives inside because the reviews live inside the component, clicking anywhere inside the reviews closes a card. And that's because the card is listening to that logic, not the reviews. So it's very simple. And there's like the spinner here. And so to showcase, to to wrap up, in the network, let me clean this up. When you're trying to optimize and you're using React suspense and you're using lazy loading and using code splitting, right? So in production right now, this has, it says 12 requests. I'm guessing 12 files associated with it. You see that Netlify uses the protocol. Can you see it? You guys see that? Should I blow that? You see that the protocol here, Netlify takes advantage of that protocol, so it's taking advantage of the splitting. And they're all chunks. And the two chunks that I really focused on were the book reviews and the book list, and these were arrays. And the reason why that was because while it's fetching, right, the book reviews or the book list doesn't need to be on the browser at that time. So looking up a book, right, we perform the API here. But as you saw, maybe there's a spinner, and it's waiting for the data to come in before it, uses that chunk of data. And so that's kind of like the code splitting that Webpack does. And I just want to know how big it was towards the end. Yeah. Oh, it's cached. So let me disable the cache. Yeah, it's like 427 kilobytes. 1 second. And then after cached, same. Oops. So if I disable the cache, 11.31, right? So that's one of the advantage of it, so that those files are living cached in your browser. Refreshing it doesn't have to go fetch. You don't have to make external calls. It's all there in the browser for you. Just take advantage of the technology that the browsers provide, and in this case, Netlify, and using that protocol. So to wrap up, very important to understand the mapping of the business logic to the technology. We go to boot camps. We read a bunch of blog posts to up our skill level, and that's great. But another skill level that you should be working on is when you have conversations with your project manager or whoever about the logic of the business, it's really good to sit down and work on those soft skills, because the more you understand the business logic, the more time it'll save you wasting, or more time it will save you mapping that logic to your technology. I mean, we already know the technology. The technology already exists. What usually is a problem is our lack of understanding of the logic when we start mapping it. One thing too is don't add unnecessary complexity. This is a small app. Do you really need to use sagas? No. Did I have it going into it? I'm going to start building it out more, hooking more APIs to it? Maybe. So sagas was, for my bias, was a route that I wanted to go to. You can easily solve this with thunks or even your own JavaScript fetches inside the components, right? It's very simple. So if you don't need it, don't add it to it. Most importantly, don't follow the hype, especially if you don't understand the problem set. Hooks are amazing. I know I barely touched on it. I promise next meetup we'll give you a more in depth in it. There's so many awesome examples we can do with it. Redux is working on a use Redux hook, which is going to be bloody awesome. It's not out there. There is a GitHub issue associated with it. Keep your eyes on that. That's going to be a game changer. Actually, yeah, I heard this too. Redux is going away because of hooks. I don't think so. The API is going to see a massive improvement into your, I guess, ridding of boilerplate code or whatever, right? But yeah, so that's it. Any questions? Yep.
Is there any reason you chose not to use Create React App and build your own React application?
I'm sorry, I can't.
Why did you not use Create React App? You know, the CLI tool that React has.
Are you asking if it's, did I use it?
Why did you not use it?
Well, while Create React App was being, I guess, finalized, I took a deep dive into Webpack. And so I learned a lot of it back in Webpack 1 or something, or 2, I forgot what it was. So I taught myself a lot of stuff about Webpack, and I just started wrapping things together. And literally, I've been using this code base for like 2 years. I've been certain modifications associated with it because the loaders change. But I mean, once you have your pipeline set up, I don't need Create React App. I mean, I used it to make sure that the Webpack configurations kind of like are match up for the stuff that I want to use. But that was it. Like you can do Create React Eject or something. But yeah, I don't. You could, yeah.
Any more questions?
Yeah, my question is less about React and more maybe about kind of data fetching in general. And if you say you're using a bunch of third-party APIs, Goodreads rather, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, whatever it is, and your thoughts on using your node services to maybe clean up that data that they give to you versus pushing all of their garbage.
I can't hear you. I can't hear
sorry.
you. I can't.
I imagine these third-party REST APIs are using Goodreads, whatever else it is, give you a lot of extraneous data that you don't necessarily need for your app. And if you use your node services to clean that data before you push it to your front end, or if you kind of just push it all and let your front end handle that cleaning up on its own.
So are you asking what I did here, or what I prefer to do?
You prefer the separation of concerns in cleaning the data.
Yeah, I would love it to be done in the backend. If it's just data, in the backend. But there's certain situations where you have to compute on the front end, especially if you do like finance, and you're doing spreadsheets, representations. So I used to work in the finance industry, and you have massive amounts of cells, right, spreadsheets, and those have to be updated. And you do the computation on the client side. You don't send the request to the back end, hey, compute this for me, send back the numbers here, right? You can just do that there. So it depends on the problem set. But I totally bias towards the back, do all the transformation in the back there. And I guess GraphQL helps you a lot with that, right?
Anyone else? Well, in that case, okay, one more.
Other than Dunk and Saga, are there any other major patterns for Redux middleware?
For the asynchronous flow, there's thunks, sagas. I think the observables is they're very. If you follow the paradigm of reactive programming, observables is probably what you want to use. But that would be the other one that I know of.
Okay, thank you.
Any other hands going up? If not, then let's give a big round of applause to Roberto.
Awesome,
Thank you very much for hosting this meetup.